Hello, Culminators. I'm very pleased to have with us today an old friend. You're tired of hearing me say it, I know, but this is one of those 80s friends. Okay, so it's Yoram Hazony, the hottest political philosopher, certainly among those who traverse the Atlantic as he does. Yoram Hazony of National Conservatism fame, and more recently, he's got a new book, which is really important, Conservatism, a Rediscovery. And we're going to talk a lot about the ideas in that book and some of the challenges of what he's got in mind, what he's talking about. Yoram, thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Ron, thank you for having me on. As good as can be. It's election day here in Jerusalem, and we have a family barbecue downstairs, hopefully to celebrate a decisive outcome for a change, but no predictions.
Is it adjusted? You wouldn't want to make predictions since this won't be up for a couple of weeks, and but as I've heard you say before, you're not, you don't claim to be in the prediction business anyway. And anyone who makes predictions regarding Israeli politics these days is really asking for trouble.
Right.
It's mind-boggling. Have you not noticed I'm sure you have. In fact, I think I just heard you. I must say that the most recent thing I listened to in preparation for this was your appearance with Andrew Sullivan,
right,
which was really good. And I was once a great admirer of his, and I still respect his intellect tremendously. And I think he asked you some really good questions. I think he really revealed some weaknesses in his outlook that I think he is probably never going to come to terms with. But there was some discussion there was some talk in your discussion with him about some of the parallels with American Israeli politics and even Netanyahu and sort of national conservative ideal and the non-ideal concept of Donald Trump. I'm not even going there now. We're gonna have time to talk about that. Let's take a step back. Tell people who are not familiar with you, which is kind of amazing to think that anyone would listen to this podcast and not be familiar with you, but this is the first time for everything. Tell us what you do, where you do it, and the things. Just, the elevator pitch for Yoram Hazony.
Okay, I don't know if I can talk fast enough for an elevator pitch, but
it's a very tall building.
I live with my wife here in Jerusalem. We have 9 children who are almost all downstairs right now. Some with spouses, some with our grandchildren. My business is ideas. I have spent decades raising money, organizing people to do serious scholarly research on subjects that are not usually covered by the universities. Questions like, what is a Jewish state? How can it be a legitimate political entity? What does it mean? What is its history? And what should you think about it? That was one of my first books. Questions like, are there any ideas of worth in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, or in Chazal, in the rabbinic literature? And if so, then why are these ideas? Why are they not studied as part of intellectual history, as part of the history of political ideas? Another big question was the Western world and Christianity shaped to any significant degree by the Jewish political tradition? There are at this point quite a few good scholars who for the last 20 years have been arguing that the answer is yes. And all of this comes down to the world in which we live today. The ideas that I'm talking about are not just ivory tower ideas. They're ideas that are important for understanding the political crisis that we're all living through right now, and for trying to shape a direction for us to go in if there's going to be any kind of restoration of the kind of America, Britain, Europe that we would want to live in or be part of. So those are the questions I deal with. In recent years, I've been chairing an outfit called the Edmund Burke Foundation, which runs annual national conservatism conferences both in America and in Europe. It's been very successful in the sense that it's rapidly growing. Is it going to grow fast enough to be able to turn things around? Only God knows.
Yes, and to paraphrase again something that I think you said to Andrew Sullivan, it is not our job to complete the work, but as they says in Pirkei Avos, but to endeavor to do it to the best of our abilities. Very, very broad translation there. You just said something that triggered me, my thinking, and again, it's not really and that's going to happen when talking to you. I have been reading this book that has disappointed me profoundly, because I'm kind of a medievalist, and I'm very interested in the history of the church and the history of Europe. And I was astonished in reading this book that there was no recognition whatsoever of where Catholicism comes from, and he was talking about all these church fathers who made these tremendous, and of course, in the back of my mind as I'm reading this was what I learned from you in your previous book about the nature of the Catholic Church as an empirical institution, not an imperial institution, as opposed to a nationalistic institution. Or one that encourages nationalism, although there are strains cutting in obviously in both directions there. But it is the fact. So it is fascinating to me to hear you say that there has been a movement, not only I assume among people such as ourselves who are deeply committed to Jewish traditional life and continuity, but I assume when you say scholars, you mean people in universities. People who don't wear yarmulkes, people who, can you tell me a little bit about that before we jump into some of the other stuff that I have been writing notes about here? Because again, you triggered the thought.
Sure. Let me begin with something, a historical fact. I'm going to oversimplify a little bit. We can fill it in a little bit more later. But the big change in the universities in Europe and America, and this eventually affects universities in Israel just as much. The big change in European universities occurred around 1810, when Christianity was replaced as the governing purpose and framework for universities in Western countries. And 1810 is the year that the University of Berlin was founded, and it had as its theory that Enlightenment rationalism, Enlightenment and science would replace Christianity as the heart of the university. This is the most famous figure associated with it is Humboldt, and he described the history of ideas as kind of as many other Enlightenment thinkers did, as kind of a superhighway going from ancient Greece, from ancient Athens, kind of more or less directly to Berlin. Okay, in between lots and lots of darkness. And so you get professors, of this kind, like Hegel, who would literally say that the light shined on mankind in Athens, and then there was 1,500 years of darkness during the Middle Ages, and then when you get to Descartes around 1600, he says, now we feel that we're reaching the shores of true philosophy and true light. This kind of bombastic reconstruction of the entire history of the Western world, as though it goes from Greece to Berlin. Now, one of the key elements of this worldview, as you can immediately guess, is that somebody's left out. And there's actually a lot of somebody's left out, but the most important somebody that's left out is Moshe Rabbeinu and the prophets of Israel and the Jewish tradition, which existed for centuries before a group of Greek-speaking Jews wrote the New Testament and founded what became the Christian Church. Now, this view has Jews and Judaism as being explicitly, Hegel says, an abject nothingness, a vacuum where no ideas were. This is Hegel's view of the contribution of Jews to Christianity and to Western civilization. So
we're talking about the Jews in the line. But in other words, we're not talking about what's going on among the Jews during the Middle Ages, when there's this incredible flowering of Talmudic scholarship. He couldn't care less about that. That's a given. We know that. We're just talking about, do the Jews who founded Christianity and thereby founded Western civilization as they knew it, did they matter at all?
Well, the Jews who founded Christianity do matter, but Hegel claims that they are a creation ex nihilo. That is, that the spirit that gave birth to Christianity was immaculate.
Complete break with the past.
It was a complete blank, but it's modeled on this immaculate conception that the ideas that are the basis of Christianity owe no debt whatsoever to the Jews. They do owe a debt to the Greeks, but not to the Jews. This is a prefabricated standard view that German academia, influenced to no small degree by actual anti-Semites, constructed this view. And even though there have been in the 200 years since then, plus there have been, both Jewish scholars and Christian scholars who have struggled against this story, but it's still the case that it is so dominant that you still, even in places where there are no anti-Semites whatsoever. The anti-Semites are gone, and you're sitting in a political theory department like the one where I studied at Rutgers, where I did my doctorate, and I literally don't think there was a single person who was anything like an anti-Semite in the department, although they were all liberals, and for them, they did the same thing. You sit down the first year in graduate school to learn political theory, and the first year you begin with Athens, and then you proceed through the same story. So they add Augustine, they add a little bit of Aquinas, but basically the story is the same.
So what the Germans did with linguistics, they also did with political philosophy.
They did it with political philosophy. They did it with philosophy.
It was Allgemein Judenrein.
Religious studies. If you think about the way that the Bible is taught in most universities today, that all is descended from the anti-Semitic German university. And if you try to take courses in Bible in most universities, you can't even study it as literature, much less study it as philosophy, as ideas that are worth something to the world.
So I don't want to get like you and I would probably enjoy this for the entire 45 minutes, but
Right.
there has been, nonetheless, you're telling me, a movement in, let's say, the last 10 years to sort of rediscover the fact that the church did not, in fact, appear out of nowhere, and that its ethics and its cultural sensibilities actually didn't come from the moon
Yeah.
or from an immaculate conception.
It's been since, I would say, since the 1990s.
Okay.
There's been a movement to try to place the Hebrew Bible and maybe even some later Jewish sources within the context of the history of Western ideas, the history of political theory, and so on. So a famous example is Professor Adrian Hastings in the 1990s wrote a book called The Construction of Nationhood, in which he was trying to understand where the idea of national independence and a world of independent states, where does that come from? And it's very clear that it doesn't come from Greece, because the Greeks had their city-states. They knew what an ethnos was, they knew what a nation was, but they didn't have the idea that the Greek nation should be united in a single independent country. And certainly didn't come from the Romans, who whose views were basically about world empire, just like the Babylonians and the Assyrians and Alexander before them. So Hastings wrote this path-breaking book, which he said, look, basically where this idea comes from is from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament. And wherever the Hebrew Bible is translated into the vernacular, into the local language, you then see in history people reading this and thinking about politics in terms of nations and of national independence. They learn from the Jews the value of an independent nation.
And where it's not translated to the vernacular, meaning where Protestantism did not take hold, that you don't have that so much. And then Germany, of course, presents that tension because you have both.
Yeah, what you're saying has truth to it, because the most important moment of thinking about national independence is with the Protestant Reformation, and particularly the Westphalia treaties, which recognize in principle the idea of national independence, different countries having different religious commitments. But I should say that people who want to see this as just Protestant versus Catholic, I think it's just not true. I think that that the Catholic idea that the universal church should be responsible for Catholicism, based in Rome, all over the world, that's an idea that emerges victorious, in the 11th century. And up until then, there's a long history of Catholic countries in which the kings were appointing the bishops. That is, the kings
as a matter of course, that wasn't scandalous. That was how the upper
that was just
church, right. Yeah.
That was just the way that Catholicism was in its early history. And so today, if you talk to knowledgeable, let's say Polish Catholics or French Catholics, who are also nationalists, Polish Catholic nationalists, French Catholic nationalists, who are steeped in this history, often you'll get a surprising answer for them, and they'll say, what are you talking about? This idea that that the Holy Roman Empire should conquer the whole world and make Catholicism the religion of the whole world centered in Rome. This is a German idea. I actually have people telling me this. They wanted to use that idea in order to crush and conquer the Polish national Catholic Church or the French National Church, the Gallican Church. So it is a little bit more complicated.
No, it is. I understand that, because if you look at the history of the Anglican Church, there's even at that late stage, even hundreds of years later, there's an understanding that, well, there are monarchs. Monarchs are fine. We don't have a problem with monarchs. In fact, I'm going to use that to drag us over to where I really thought we were going to be talking, because, but I think it's a perfect segue, and you actually helped me make it, which is in places where the Hebrew Bible is studied, in places where the vernacular is studied, let's talk about Puritans. Let's talk about, and as we know, the English Puritans were very involved with Old Testament study in a way that had not been as in vogue, certainly in previous years. And among the founding fathers and their generation of intellectuals, knowing Hebrew was a thing.
Yep.
Now let's get to your new book. This idea, and the segue is going to become more clear. This idea that what is needed is a sort of spiritual, political renaissance, or rebirth, renewal, which is 100. You're not going to get any. That's the only possible way that this society survives. Well, Jane Coleman and I, my wife, our idea of a Shabbos table conversation is talking about what happened to the Puritans. I mean, after the Divrei Torah said, we can't figure, because she teaches American literature, and she's from New England, and we're always wrestling with this idea that here you had the Puritans, who were supposedly the ethical and spiritual and cultural fathers of America. And as Orthodox Jews, there's so much about their sensibility. Well, there's a lot that's very different from the way we see things, but there's also a lot that resonates. And yet we see that once they start waxing rich, the religious fervor, the focus, the dedication, the large families, the work ethic disintegrate. And one of the things that Andrew Sullivan said to you was, even if we can posit this idea that it's necessary and healthy for a society to regenerate its spiritual institutions and its respect for traditional religious structures to succeed, how do you do that when people simply can't believe anymore? So one factor that I think that has been corrosive toward belief is wealth. But that doesn't have to be the case. We see in our community, I don't mind saying that it's understood that wealth is a challenge to one's spirituality, but there are nonetheless many people who do very well and who also do very, seem to be very committed to, to religious belief. Let's talk about the Puritans, okay? Because when I was looking at your book and I was seeing this historical, I'm actually going to put, had meant to get it back on the screen. There have been these cycles in, let's say, American history. Let's focus, small ball here, okay? Where we've had these renewals of religious faith. So the Puritans come here, and then they sort of ebb out. They, their spiritual influence and their cultural influence really, they become liberals. They become what we call the mainline Protestant denominations, which are the ones that have. There's no difference between them, basically the Democratic Party cultural, program. If people don't believe that the Bible really means what it says, and in Revelation, what are we working with? What it's the 22nd, it's the 21st century. 22nd. It's the 22nd year of the 21st century. Or is it the 23rd year? People who don't believe aren't gonna go back to believing. This is what Andrew Sullivan was knocking you on the head about. I think you said you don't have an answer. Well, we need to figure it out, right? Because you and I believe, But it's just,
No, I do. No, I do have an answer. It's just, it's difficult for Andrew. It's difficult for a lot of people.
say it again, because I heard it.
Okay, well, look, let me first just sharpen your point about.
You're good at that. Thank you.
About the need for a return to biblical religion, right? And my, for people who don't know me, my basic line is if you grew up in a Christian family, you should be going back to Christianity. If you grew up in a Jewish family, you should be going back to Judaism. I certainly express my belief in and preference for Judaism. I tell people I think it's the most direct way to reach God. But I think that right now we're talking about politics, and what we're looking at is a crisis of a kind that none of us have ever seen before in our lifetimes. After the Second World War, both in America and Europe, the political culture was revised to adopt something that's called liberalism or Enlightenment liberalism as a substitute religion. Like the replacement for the old Christianity was this liberalism. Liberalism is it's a political theory, but it's based on views that directly challenge both Christianity and Judaism.
And it's an absolute good in and of itself.
Right. So the claim is that the claim of Enlightenment liberal thinkers is that basically what you need to know about politics is that that all men are created perfectly free and perfectly equal by nature. Their nature makes them free and equal. That moral and political obligations are taken upon yourself through a process of consent. If you don't consent, then you're not really obligated in most cases. And finally, that the purpose of government is only to protect the rights, the rights and the equalities that were given to man by nature. This set of ideas, it's possible for somebody to be a Christian or a Jew, a serious Christian or a serious Jew, and to sort of simultaneously hold these things. But the problem is that over time, these axioms, these assumptions cut biblical religion to pieces. I mean, there is a difference between a biblical view, which says that God gives mitzvot. There are commandments which shape the moral and political world, and we are obligated. And this is with regard to Jews as well as Christians and others, that we have obligations that are not chosen by us. We're born into a family. We have the obligation to honor your father and your mother, even though you did not choose your father and your mother. And that obligation goes throughout your entire life. Till they die, and after they die, you're still obligated to honor your father and your mother, even though you never chose it. So there is a collision between liberalism and biblical religion, but for quite a while, in America and in Britain and other places, that there was kind of a seesaw battle, and a lot of people were in between. After World War II, what happens is that the trauma of the two world wars cause or allow the liberals to insist that no more. Now we have a cultural revolution. We're gonna ban God and Bible and prayer from the schools. That's going to be privatized. It's going to be in the churches. We have no need for it to be part of the public arena. And from that moment, which begins in 1947, when the U.S. Supreme Court declares separation of church and state for the first time to be an integral part of the American Constitution and imposes it on all 48 states, from that moment, there's the beginning of a steep, radical cultural revolution that continues with liberalism privatizing and eliminating biblical religion, first in the public space, but then once you send kids to school for 5 days a week, year after year after year, and none of their teachers, none of the principals, none of the guest speakers are allowed to talk about God or about the Bible or to pray. Once kids go to school for 2 generations in that, then they come out, they're not Christians, they're not Jews, they're liberals. Now, the second important point is to understand that liberalism proved itself to be incapable of sustaining itself. You know, a lot of people say, you know, okay, the liberal years weren't so bad. They weren't so bad for Jews. They weren't so bad for other people. But the problem is that even the good parts about it are not sustainable. The year 2020 is the year that Andrew Sullivan and Barry Weiss and Bennett and the rest of these liberals were kicked out of their formerly liberal institutions. They were kicked out. Why? Because they were liberals. Right? Who kicked them out? Who kicked them out is the young people who've grown up under liberalism and have exercised reason and have thought carefully about, you know, about all of these things, and their reason has led them to be woke neo-Marxists. And those woke neo-Marxists, they're not liberals at all. They're the children of liberals, but they're not liberals. And in 2020, they effectively took control over almost all of the formerly liberal institutions in America and Britain and in various European countries also. So we have now reached a moment where if you're a Christian or a Jew, or you know, if you believe in the Tanakh, or even if you don't believe, which is the question you were asking, even if you don't believe, but you see what's coming and you see this woke neo-Marxism, you understand it's going to destroy everything that we value. You know, whether we're conservatives or liberals, it's going to destroy everything that we value. You see this coming and you try to understand what force could be strong enough to stand up against this. It's not going to be liberalism. Liberalism has already failed. Right? There's still some liberals. It's not. So the question is, what could it be? And the only answer I know of is biblical restoration, is the restoration of the power and strength of the biblical vision, both among Christians and among Jews.
Okay, so now you've actually sharpened my question. So now, given that, so again, from the Jewish point of view, we understand that if I might not be a paragon of the Musar school when I say this, but maybe Hasidim would be more sympathetic to this approach. Whether or not your faith is perfect, whether or not you are still a little bit fighting with God, or you don't really live with his immanence the way you should, we none of us understand as Jews, I have a set of responsibilities, and I must get up and I must go to services in the morning, and I must put those boxes in my head, and I'm gonna do it. And I've analogized this in the past to method acting. I will use these tools as a way to evoke my connection to God, because the tradition tells me that they will.
Yep.
Liberalism cannot deal with this at all, because it's utterly irrational. It's irrational, and it's premised entirely on accepting the legitimacy of a tradition.
Yep.
And that was cut out from under. I noticed when you mentioned this, that 1947 point as a turning point, and I think turning points are always could always, like, it's nice to have a good turning point. I mean, FDR was the 30s. Dewey was the 30s. I would agree with you that there was more of a sort of a consensus that we're going to go to church on Sunday morning, whether we're feeling all that religious or not, because that's what an American does. And that probably continues through the 50s, when the people who grew up in the 30s were raising families, and that they understood that's what you do. But as you said, it's not sustainable. I keep thinking of Churchill as an example of someone who was not a particularly spiritual person. He, in fact, you'd have to call him an agnostic. But as prime minister of the UK. He understood that certain things should be done as through the Anglican Church. In other words, that you have something called a Christian nation, and Christianity for Englishmen is a package, a traditional package of values that we may or may not always live up to. And again, one of the things that's really struck me about your conversation with Andrew Sullivan was liberals are absolutely thrown into a panic by hypocrisy. But how could you vote for? It's true, Trump was the only force who could have saved us from Biden and what's going on in the United States right now. But he can't vote for him. He's what we call in Yiddish an Oisvarf. He's a bum. He's a really crooked. I'm not looking for a son-in-law. I'm looking for the president of the United States who's going to make policy choices that are the right ones for me and my family. And he couldn't. I listened to that guy. I saw the vein in his head popping when he was asking you these questions. He just, because it's a very, very common refrain.
Yeah, look, there's in my new book on conservatism, I try to understand what is at the heart of a traditional society that, you know, that makes it function, that makes it possible for it to work. And a small part of the argument that I make in this book is that the mitzvah of giving kavod, okay, when you give kavod to somebody,
respect,
right? Well,
honor. We need to translate it.
Right. Okay. So the best translation is honor.
Reverence?
But is on. I think the best translation is honor. But I want to explain what I mean by this, because in the Hebrew, the word kavod, it's related to the word kaved, which is to say that when you give honor, kaved means weighty. It means it literally refers to the heaviness or the weightiness, the heft of something. It's and when you give honor to someone, what you're doing is you're saying to them, I consider you to be weighty, to be of significance. You're telling them you're important to me. That might be you're honoring your parents. It might be because you speak in an honoring way, that you speak in a way that that praises them, that praises the way that they live. But it also has to do with the way you act. You act as though the things that they think and say are important. And when you disagree, because of course, you know, children there are always going to be disagreements between children and parents, but honoring your parents involves learning to say things like Abba, my father. Is it possible? What would you say in consideration to the following question? That's a way of honoring him by letting him answer rather than saying, no, you're wrong, much less, you know, you're stupid because you're wrong. Now, this honoring is not just something that relates to your parents. All of conservative society is based on honoring. I mean, you can see that in the Bible, that you're supposed to honor elders. You're supposed to give honor. You're supposed to give honor to God. You're supposed to give honor to the priests and the scholars. I mean, the whole society is constructed around an understanding of what are the most important values, and raising children from a small age to honor those values. Now, honoring does not mean that you have to tell lies. You don't have to, you don't necessarily have to say, oh, you know, God did great things. God did great things for us. My parents did great things for me. If you feel that you're being that you're skeptical or you're doubtful, then you might decide to be silent. You might decide to be carefully evade the issue for a while. But what you're not going to do is you're not going to step forward and say, I think that there is no God of Israel. I think that the government is just a bunch of liars. I think that my parents were abused me growing up, and I'm going to start my own religion because I can think for myself, and my brain is smart enough so that I can simply come up with something better than 3,000 years of Jewish thinking. That is not a conservative way of thinking. That's the way that children are taught in school today. They go to school and they are told, you're smart enough. You should decide whether your parents are right or wrong, whether your teachers are right or wrong, whether your government is right or wrong, whether God is right or wrong. And you know what? There is something noble about that. There is something noble about the search for truth. But if you search for truth in a society that has no capacity for honor, for kavod, for making things weighty, once a truth, a tradition has been discovered that works, that works for most people, if you're not able to give honor, then you're not able to learn. And this is the decisive point, is when the Christians decided in America to stop giving honor to God and Bible and in the schools, when they stopped teaching honoring, they stopped teaching to honor your parents, they stopped teaching to honor veterans, to people who serve in the army, they stopped teaching honor. And that's an integral clash. That's the inherent clash between a liberal way of life in which you're only and always told, judge for yourself. There's no point in honoring anything unless you personally have decided that it's worth honoring. Okay, and a conservative society where the assumption is the opposite. The assumption is, you know what, who am I? You know, maybe I think differently. So maybe I'll end up deciding that, you know, that I believe differently and I'll change my life. But the assumption is that thousands of years of history have led us to a certain way of life. Our parents uphold it, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, so many brilliant people and good people have upheld it. Who am I to decide that 3,000 years of history gets to be thrown in the trash and that the whole public sphere should be swept clean? Who am I to make a decision like that? So this is as you said it's irrational. I would say it's pre-rational. Like either you grow up with the capacity to honor achievements of others, even if you don't understand them, or you grow up with the capacity without that capacity, and then you think, well, I have contempt for people. I don't understand what this guy said, so I have contempt for him. I'm better. Let me run things. That's the fight.
And for me, another turning point, and we're coming up on a ridiculously long podcast here, and I'm sorry, but you know, we have a lot of catching up to do. I don't know if we've seen each other in person since I disappeared from the couch in your apartment during reunions in '86, you know, before you got up. But the Obergefell decision was a turning point also, but not for the reason most people think. And right. Obviously, Obergefell says, who are we to say what marriage means? Answer, we're the ones to say. We're the judges. We're the justices. But what really happened in Obergefell was, not what really happened, but something else that happened in Obergefell was that the majority said, not only is the dissent wrong, they have no right to hold that position. And for holding that position, they're bigots. And in dissent, Scalia says, whoa. Or was it Roberts? Do you realize you're turning an entire millennia old tradition into a 21st century concept of political correctness? You can't just say, because you've outvoted us, that now we're illegitimate. But to me, that is a child of what you're talking about. They could not hold of the weightiness of there's a lack of respect, a lack of kavod that you no longer are expected to extend to intellectual adversaries. Well, listen, I will continue to hold tremendous respect for you, but I just think we you know, everyone should read this book. I think you are struggling with those issues that I think people, and especially people who are fortunate to live a life of faith and understand what it does for a human. You know, I used to be someone who believed he had to. It's all about me, right? Who had to understand everything. And when I first went to Aish Torah in Jerusalem, I'm not going to do. Everyone was going to the Steipler. I was there when the Steipler passed away. Okay, Rabbi Kanievsky, great leader of the Jewish people, and everyone went to the funeral. Come on, this is an historic event. You should go. I don't know who he is. Why would I do that? I mean, I'm not convinced of that. I missed out on that. I was alone. I was alone in the old city of Jerusalem. Everybody else, because I thought I had to be convinced of every single thing before. I missed out on that. One of the things you grow up, and and this is an aspect of maturity also, right? I mean, you have 9 children, as you mentioned. As you grow up, as you raise children, you begin to understand the limitations of your judgment and of your ability to control things and to understand things and to predict things. As you know, in order to be on the Sanhedrin, the great Jewish high court, a judge had to be married and have children. You had to have that completeness. I mean, we live in a society now where people have very small families, if they have committed families at all, and they don't, large families, or even Catholics don't have large families anymore. To me, that is listen, I sound like one of those people, one of those wretched old people complaining about the old days, but that's what we do, I guess.
Right. Well, very quickly, I think the answer to the question of how can you bring back a country that's on the brink, where people have lost the traditions and lost the capacity to honor them. So I think the basic point, the most important point, is that that the fact that the traditions are dying or dead in most places doesn't mean that they're dying and dead in all places. And part of what I'm asking in the book is for those places where there's still a majority that is capable of upholding a Christian moral vision, a biblical moral vision, and it could be believing Christians and former Christians and Jews and all sorts of others. But there are many places in America where, if you see what's coming, you see the Marxist cultural revolution, what it's done and what it's going to do. I think that it's possible to put together a pro-Christian, a pro-biblical majority in many places that's willing to reconstruct a public life on the basis of precedents from earlier in American history and also from other countries. And I also think in your private life, and this is the last, my last point on this, is that in your private life, being a conservative is not just about voting every 4 years or every 2 years. Being a conservative is primarily about leading a conservative life. And so what I tell young people is, if you are not a member of a congregation where there are older people who are still living a life of conservation and transmission, then you can't learn. You have no capacity to learn from past generations, from past centuries. You can't just open up a book and think that you're learning about the past. It doesn't work that way. Seeing how people who've been married for 60 years, seeing in real life with your own eyes how they uphold their marriage, that's the only way that you can learn how to keep your marriage together. If you don't do that, you won't be able to keep your marriage together. And the same applies for many other things. So the bottom line is, if people are willing to join a conservative congregation, Christian or Jewish, or that's still handing down the traditions, if they're willing to be a part of a political effort to revitalize the biblical public vision in those places where a majority for it can be mustered, then I think it may be that God will see this repentance and have rachamim, have some pity on us, and give us another chance.
That's a great point. I mean, after all, the city of Nineveh, why would it matter what happened in the city of Nineveh? Because God says, I want to see Jonah. What's going to happen in the city of Nineveh? That's where I'm going to run the test now. And it's amazing to me what you just said. Jeremy, my producer, tell me if you remember this correctly. I think when we did a virtual event in Iowa where someone asked a question along the lines of, what can we do? And I think I might have even said something very similar to what Yoram just said, which was that your life must reflect conservative values. It's not, and this is the evil of libertarianism. It must be real. It can't just be you can't be a philosophical or ethical dilettante. It must be real. And that means even though you're in college, that hookup culture is not going to be, part of something that you participate in. And that's really hard because people growing up in the mass media culture, the incredibly overly sexualized culture. And as you said, everything hinges on consent. Everything hinges on consent. And if two people or entities agree to it, then it's okay. That's really, really hard for us to understand now. With your consent, however, I will end this discussion, and hopefully they've left. Hazonis don't strike me as people who are going to not leave you something warm still to eat. So go back to the barbecue. Thank you so much, Yoram. We really have been trying to put this together for such a long time, and I missed the train with the last book, but this time we're good to go, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. And of course, I'm hearing from you all the time through Rabbi Zupnik. I mean, he buttonholes me frequently to tell me about his most recent triumph in explaining things to you.
Okay, very good.
All the best.
Thank you so much. Kol Tuv. Bye.
You too.